My name is Colette Wahlquist, and I work for International Media Support based in Copenhagen, Denmark. Delighted to be here today, co-hosting with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Tallinn, Estonia, at the Global Conference for Media Freedom. To briefly introduce IMS, we are the biggest media development organization in the Nordic region, working in over 30 countries across 4 continents, promoting press freedom, good journalism, and the safety of journalists. We are notably very active members in the consultative network of the Media Freedom Coalition, and very grateful to the Estonian Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for helping put together this session today, and also this awesome tech team in the back. In my role at IMS, I focus on the support for safety of journalists. This is through research, evidence-based advocacy, strategic alliance building, and I had the privilege of helping produce this session today. And we have titled it Gender Disinformation, Tech and Democracy, How Rethinking Our Digital Infrastructure Can Help Promote Media Freedom and Build a More Gender-Just World. We've convened this session because IMS is wholly committed to combating this fast-evolving, highly demoralizing trend of gender disinformation. When a woman is targeted in the digital space, the whole sector is at risk. In this session, we're going to explore what is big tech's role in gender disinformation, how the media and the media freedom community at large is an imminent target, as well as an integral part of the long-term solutions. And to kick off today, I want to try and paint a picture of what exactly gender disinformation is. First, by definition, we're calling this a subset of online harassment, false or misleading, focused on gendered and sex-based narratives against women. And it's pushing particularly women journalists and other women social leaders out of the public debate at alarming rates. This form of harassment combines 3 defining characteristics of online disinformation. This is falsity, malign intent, and coordination. And a plain definition doesn't really do justice to the magnitude of this trifecta. And so to describe it in action, this is our journalist, Nobel laureate Maria Russo, who we all know. This is her being trolled en masse as a prostitute, and the series of other nasty names tied to both her identity as a female and also her career as a journalist. And this is also the hundreds of other women journalists who have been threatened with the spread of superimposed pornographic photos and other sordid kinds of images just for speaking back to power. One of which I have the privilege of sharing the stage with today, who we may hear more about this. As women's equal right to freedom of expression is indispensable for media freedom and the achievement of peace, democracy, and sustainable development, this session explores how gender disinformation is a defining challenge and part of a systemic problem with our current digital infrastructure, namely our social media platforms. And I'll be passing the floor in a moment to my dear colleague Magnus, reporting from Copenhagen. He'll be moderating this session on how local and global coalitions are needed to ensure our digital infrastructures serve the public interest, media freedom and democracy, and gender equality in the human rights framework. And massive thanks to Magnus again. He is actually down with COVID, so he's propped up behind us. He wasn't able to travel to Tallinn. He would have been with us today. So thank you, Magnus. Magnus is the Public Interest Tech Advisor at International Media Support. He is a human rights advocate, journalist, researcher, and founder of Bridge Figures, which is a human rights project in the data-driven world. He spent more than a decade defending the right to freedom of expression from Hong Kong to New York, formerly at Freemuse, Committee to Protect Journalists, and now with us at IMS. Over to you, Magnus. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Colette. Yeah, extra thank you for being there, for pulling this off. You've done an amazing job. And thank you to everyone in the room and online for joining us. Very excited to be here. Thought it would be in person, but thanks to a great tech team in Thailand, we were able to shift things around when I got a positive COVID test. So now I'm here online from my home in Copenhagen, and super excited for this talk, where we will have three amazing speakers to talk about gender disinformation and how we can change the situation, both long-term solutions and also kind of more immediate things. And they are Anne Kale, who's the chief advisor at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Asuk Gaibula, who's a freelance journalist in Turkey and with you on stage for those of you in Tallinn, and Mevish Ansari, who's heading digital at Article 19. But before I introduce our speakers a little bit more, I just want to set the stage. We have a little more than an hour here to dive into these complex issues. And I want to do that by giving the speakers time to kind of tell their story, their side of the story from different perspectives, different stakeholders. As you might know, we have a state, we have a working journalist, and we have a civil society representative. But then fairly quickly, I want to move us into a conversation so we can kind of explore new solutions, new ways forward in this. And there to the audience, both in the room and online, I really want to bring you in, and we have set time aside for this. So please already now start thinking if you have contributions, might even have good solutions already, or just a question or a comment. Please be ready for that. And before I turn to our speakers, I just want to set the stage and how we at IMS kind of see developments, and two developments in particular over the past 20 years have really kind of fundamentally changed how media systems, media freedom, human rights, democracies actually work. And those two developments, as we see them, are first a fundamental shift for media to be past directed recording platforms like a newspaper who told you what happened yesterday to data-driven anticipation of the future. And this is a broad definition of media, not just like classic media, but like social media is using data to predict what might interest you next. That's the right. That is such a fundamental shift of how our communication systems work, how our digital infrastructures work, that are really challenging and has a lot of potential in it. The second shift that we kind of zero in on when we try to strategize at IMS is that states and other powerful actors have taking this new situation and changed from what you could call an ideology of information scarcity, where the primary approach was to censor, to shut down newspapers. And it's not that has stopped, but now we've moved into what we could call an ideology of information abundance. You flood the streams with all kind of crazy stories, false or true, but directing the conversation or spreading the conversations. And in that, women journalists and other prominent female voices are targeted disproportionately, right? You have this barrage of harassment, of threats, of lies, of all kind of things that are designed to disrupt our conversations, our democratic conversations, our journalistic practices. This is being flooded with alternatives, and you know that very well, and some of our speakers today can speak to it more. But I just want to highlight those two developments as fundamental to how we see the world evolving. And that has generated, of course, this vast scale of disinformation and gender disinformation, of hate speech, but it's also undermining our local media business models. And you've seen examples of like a Cambridge Analytica scandal, and you have the genocide in Myanmar, where tech platforms played a significant role and took some of responsibility later on. And you have the general democratic backsliding. And finally, you have a privatization and a monopolization of data and knowledge about our societies. A lot of all of this information and knowledge that we need to address the above is in data. And we don't necessarily have the access to that data. That's a handful of American and Chinese companies. And in what Shoshana Zuboff has called removing to a pre-Gutenberg order, which I think is a powerful statement that should kind of resonate at a media freedom conference, that there's a few companies now that know how our societies actually work, what's up and down. And in particular, or on gender disinformation, such a new phenomenon at the scale that we see it now, it's very hard to get the actual data to understand the problem. Like there's individual accounts, and we'll hear some of them, of how journalists are targeted, and the kind of scary situation you're in as an individual when this hits you. But aggregated, what are the patterns? What are the patterns across platforms? And it's not just the tech company's fault. There's privacy laws that are good and other intention and good reasons to be there, but that limits our basic understanding of what are these data-driven dynamics actually doing to our societies. So that's kind of where we see the big problems. But then I want to say, like, it's not that we're not hopeful at IMS, and that I'm personally hopeful. There's a lot of opportunity in this, and I thought one funny way of illustrating this was, I just returned from paternity leave, and in between changing diapers and playing with my little daughter, I got to flip through this issue of the New Yorker, and a print issue, mind you, and I came across this funny or weird advertising from Google. We keep people safe online more than anyone else in the world. And then they bought another page. Every day, Google blocks 100 million pitching attempts. And one more. Every day, Google protects 4 billion devices from risky sites. And it's not that I want to advertise for Google. I was just like, why are this like the dominant advertising machine in the world buying paper space in the New Yorker magazine? And I thought, this is symbolic of a change. Like, these companies, and Facebook is in a league of its own right now, are seeing shifts, and they're worried, and they're trying to kind of gain back the momentum and tell, in this case, I would say, I don't know, American liberal elites that they're good, they're doing something good, right? But they're losing the narrative. There are different companies than they were 10 years ago. They're on the back burner, and just, Facebook in particular, just this past week, right? You've seen plummeting of their share value. You've seen falling for the first time drop in global users, and then you've seen Zuckerberg threatening pulling out of Europe. Like, so these are not companies in a comfortable position, and it's not that they're not going to be around and dominate and be instrumental to our communications, to disinformation, to all these issues that we're addressing today. But I just want to set the frame for this conversation that something is changing. There's something in this moment that gives me hope and potential. And for a community like ours, and for different stakeholders with an interest in democracy and media freedom, I think this is the time to start thinking of alternative, thinking of pluralities of technical solutions, pluralities of local solutions, rather than having just one or two big companies dominate as they currently do. And this is not to say one company is necessarily bad, but it's just at a certain point when you become big, one mistake in a big company is a big mistake for all of us. So that's kind of my hope for this conversation, that we can kind of look beyond and look at how can we change these things. And one thing is certain, that is that it's going to take a multi-stakeholder approach. And again, that's why I'm especially pleased that we have the great speakers that we have today. And to kick us off, Anne Kale, who's the chief advisor at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, will get the floor to talk about this new initiative from the Danish government, Tech for Democracy, that IMS has been a civil society partner in from the beginning. It's less than a year old. It's a really exciting project. We're proud to be part of it, and I'll let Anne describe more of the details of what's going on at the moment and what the motivation to start this project was. But I just want to say that that's a really interesting perspective, and the multi-stakeholder approach is, of course, also central to this, and one of the reasons why we're so proud of being part of it. And then, in full disclosure, of course, the Danish MFA is one of our big donors, no surprise, and it's been with us from the start when IMS was founded 20 years ago. So a big thank you for that, of course. And then I will pass the word over to you, Anna, to tell us a bit more about Tech for Democracy and what you've been up to lately. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Magnus. And also thanks to MFC and to the Estonian government for hosting this very important event. And thanks to IMS for moderating this panel today. Maybe just to start a bit with the broader picture, I think, Magnus, now you highlighted some of the challenges we have and opportunities, but I think it's important to kind of put in the center that the whole advancement of media freedom and human rights really is vital to counter the increased pressure we see on democracy, fundamental rights, and civil society, which is something we've witnessed for now more than 15 years, offline as well as online. So I know that we're focusing today on the digital aspects, but it's really important that the offline and online goes hand in hand. As you also alluded to, we have many examples of how digital technologies and digital infrastructure is posing a threat to democracy and human rights, and also including media freedom, but also create many opportunities. And as part of Denmark's work across all our development cooperation and also international efforts to really strengthen and promote democracy and human rights, we do believe that we have to do much more to look at these challenges and opportunities that we have in the digital era, especially with a view to how we can ensure that we include marginalized groups, that we include the aspects that are related to, for instance, as we speak about today, to adjust gender approach online, but keep on having this human rights-based approach to our technological development. What is very key in this whole Tech for Democracy initiative is that governments cannot do this alone. I mean, no sector can work on this alone. We really have to do this in a multi-stakeholder approach. We do believe that tech companies must take greater responsibility, but also that we need to include civil society and civil society stakeholders at large more meaningfully in addressing the opportunities and challenges we see with digital technologies. And again, ensure that we have this human rights-based approach to how we address the issues and how we develop and use digital infrastructures. And that's why we have launched this Tech for Democracy initiative with the overall aim of making tech work for democracy, not against democracy. So we're really using this opportunity to look at the opportunities we see to strengthen the positive aspects as well. And the core of Tech for Democracy is to bring together stakeholders that currently are maybe not speaking and working so strongly together as we think we should be in order to really address these challenges and opportunities we have at hand. So it's really about bringing together governments, bringing together multilateral stakeholders, tech companies and civil society. And the whole aim is really to learn from each other, to look at how can we actually work together and identify some of these solutions, because we do believe that nobody has the answer right now, and how do we tackle a lot of these challenges that you're also mentioning, because it's so complex. But the only way we can really do it is to get, as you're saying, the data, the understanding, the different approaches from both tech companies, governments and civil society to jointly find a way to track these issues going forward. The Tech for Democracy initiative was launched at a conference in November last year. You can still watch it online if you are interested and didn't see it yet. And with that conference, we marked the beginning of a year of action where we're really doing this multi-stakeholder push for Tech for Democracy. During the conference, we launched the Copenhagen Pledge, which is the Copenhagen Pledge for Tech for Democracy, which is the overall value frame and guiding principle for the initiative, which focuses on different aspects related to how we think we can push this agenda forward. A lot of it also links to the topics we will speak about today. And throughout this year of action, we'll be mobilizing support to the pledge to ensure that we have, governments, tech companies, civil society stakeholders, and multilaterals again walking the walk and talking the talk by actually signing on to the pledge and committing to making a difference in the way they work on Tech for Democracy. We've also launched what we call action coalitions, which are really multi-stakeholder initiatives that implement the vision of the pledge. And we have different topics that are being addressed through these action coalitions. I can mention, we can maybe also get back to that at a later stage in this session, that we're working with the US on an action coalition on gender-based online harassment and abuse. And the aim of that is, especially as you were mentioning in the beginning, like to get a better sense and understanding of what is it that is required to really address this issue. What is it we can do as international stakeholders to prevent online gender-based abuse, and what is that is required in a multi-stakeholder fashion to move this agenda forward. So maybe let me just finish off by that and saying that we're really happy also that you and others are part of the whole Tech for Democracy initiative, and we really think that this is a way forward, and it has already shown that when we bring different perspectives into the mix, that we can find better solutions to these topics jointly. Thanks, Magnus.
Thank you so much. And it's such and this multi-stakeholder approach is of course so important for us to be part of. And actually a subset of that has been really interesting is to also just talk to other NGOs. Now we're in a media freedom coalition setting with other media freedom organizations. But as we work in Tech for Democracy, it's of course with NGOs from all different kind of sectors struggling with very many of the same issues. So that's one of the opportunities it's given us at IMS to kind of look at this with other civil society organizations and then with companies. But our main focus is of course on media and how media can contribute. What are the challenges journalists are facing, and also how journalism and a journalist's kind of unique understanding of implementing and working with the public interest is some of what the tech field is missing. So we always go back to the journalistic root of our organization. That's what we know. That's where our partners are. That's their expertise. And that's our contribution to the tech debate, so to say. It is what journalism can bring back to it. It is what media freedom, how that is relevant and how's that ensured. Therefore, I'm extremely grateful to have Arzu Geyballa with us, who's a freelance journalist based in Istanbul, but who's in Tallinn now with those of you in the room. Arzu is an Azerbaijani columnist and writer, and she has a special focus on digital authoritarianism and the impact on human rights and press freedom in Azerbaijan. She's written for leading publications around the world and has a byline with CNN International. She's also featured at BBC's 100 Women Changemakers, and in 2019 she launched the Azerbaijan Internet Watch. So I'm very pleased to hand the word to you, Arzu, to tell us a little bit about your personal experience, but also, of course, your kind of professional analysis of what's going on and what the situation is for you personally and in Azerbaijan and globally. Big questions, but the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Magnus, for that great introduction, and thank you for having me here today. Unfortunately, I'm not as optimistic as you are when it comes to the progress that we're expecting platforms and tech companies to make when it comes to gender disinformation and harassment overall. And it's not because I think that we don't have what it takes as stakeholders in this conversation, but I think it's because I generally sense lack of genuine interest on behalf of tech companies and social media platforms to actually engage in these changes that would be long-term and actually have an impact. But let me take a step back and bring in more of personal experience into this conversation, and a lot of it is related to my journalism work and how much, as a result of the type of stories that I write on, where I write, who I am as a person, has been used to target me online predominantly, but also how that translated into offline conversations about my profession, about my reputation, and whatnot. And to give a bit of a context, I am originally from Azerbaijan, a country where with questionable leadership that's been criticized in a number of international reports. And I've been covering the developments in the country for the last 12 years. I write often on political developments, crackdowns, but more recently I've been covering the extent of information controls and authoritarian technology that's been deployed by the authorities in Azerbaijan. But interestingly enough, it's not this type of work that's been used to target me. It's been mostly my gender and my involvement in the work in the peace process between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Over the years, me working and writing about the conflict from conflict-sensitive reporting prism, me reporting on this recent war that took place in 2020 trying not to focus so much on an aggressive behavior of the two sides, but focusing more on the consequences of the war and whatnot. But this is how it was used to target me, that I am a traitor, that I'm not a true patriot, because I'm advocating for peaceful resolution to this conflict and whatnot. And the most recent example of this was a so-called fact-checking platform that imitates itself after an actual fact-checking platform that does exist in the country, publishing this long-form investigative piece about my professional career, my personality, and they used a number of stories that government media published about me in the past, and the way it's been reported on as this, very impressive investigative piece about who I am, in reality it was a total untrue piece of information that was shared. And when I thought of doing something about it, they tweeted the article, they tagged me on Twitter, and my first immediate reaction was, as has been in the past, to document it and to add it to the previous existing file and folder that I have on harassment that I face online. But now that I've been dealing with this for, 6, 7, 8 years, it also kind of felt very pointless because, even if I document it, that account will continue targeting myself or other journalists, women journalists including. So it didn't really make much sense. However, that being said, I think it is important to document. And this is something that we've been talking among journalists who have been facing online harassment or this kind of disinformation online, is that documenting, making sure that you have these threats, these comments, as evidence that you can then use in communication with the platforms. And I'll give you one other example, sort of shifting the attention from my personal experience with having to deal with this type of experiences. One of the biggest challenges that we have with social media platforms, at least in the case of Azerbaijan, is when journalists who are being targeted with misinformation, they have a hard time explaining to the social media platforms that this is really a threat to their safety, that this is a threat to their freedom of expression and freedom of the media in the country. And the reason for that is because social media platforms lack contextual information about the countries where they operate. And Azerbaijan is just one of many countries where this is the case. And what happens in these cases is, because these journalists, because these media platforms do not have enough communication channels with these platforms, this information stays online and it continues to exist. And it only takes an intervention from a third party, from a third organization, from an organization that has direct ties with these social media platforms to actually mitigate the risk of what the journalist or the media platform has been facing online. And I think this is really important. One of the things that I wanted to add in my sort of recommendations in this brief intervention that I had is that digital platforms, tech companies, must have a better response mechanism, especially in countries where they lack contextual information. And for that, they really need to hire people who understand political environment, who understand the context, and most importantly, who speak the local language, because that is one of the biggest challenges that I've observed in the last couple of years, having to work with social media platforms mitigating these kind of risks. Another issue and another recommendation that I would like to highlight is the algorithms. a lot of the times the decisions that are made by platforms are simply put on the algorithms. And these algorithms we don't know nothing about. And no matter the times that the civil society stakeholders have reached out to companies to actually share the code, share the language of these algorithms so that we as journalists, we as women in politics or in general, civil society actors who actually do experience this have a say in the development of this code, of this language, are able to influence it. And every time the companies say that they cannot disclose it or that it's a privacy matter. So that's another recommendation that I would like to stress. And finally, I think if we're thinking long term, no matter how many tools we have in our disposal as targets or as journalists or as civil society actors, I think it takes media literacy, it takes education and critical thinking across the whole society to actually change perceptions around these issues, because we can have the best tools, we may have the best mechanisms in place, but it takes the whole sort of society to act upon this in order to be able to perhaps not put an end, but at least create the space for an understanding that the gender disinformation, online harassment, this is not okay. And no one should be facing it, not just women, but marginalized groups and other targets. Thanks.
Thank you. Am I back on? Yes. Thank you so much. This is very interesting and inspiring, and I'm glad you're hitting the point that we shouldn't be too optimistic in the short term. I think my kind of attempt to remain optimistic is very much in focusing on the long term. I know the struggles that you and others face, and we at IMS, and I think every time I talk to a partner anywhere in the world, they have the same complaint around the responses from these platforms, how slow they are, how ignorant they are of the local context. And part of my hope comes from that's exactly what local media has. They have local context understanding. There's something here to build on that the tech industry right now is lacking, and we as a media community has some of that. It's not easy, but there's some there that gives me hope. Not that the tech companies are going to solve it by themselves, but that maybe we can contribute somehow in the long run. I don't want to get ahead of myself. This is also for the conversation later, but I'm really excited then to introduce our next speaker, who is Mavish Ansari, who heads digital at Article 19 and has some really interesting work going on and on how you can advocate for human rights in the design and development of internet infrastructure. And just kind of clarification on wording. Up until now, we've used infrastructure a bit broad. That's how we use it at IMS. Currently, where social media is, for example, also considered infrastructure in that it kind of facilitates conversations. I know Mavish has a slightly more narrow definition, just not to confuse anyone. It's really interesting work, and it aligns, and it's very similar, and we're in great admiration of what you've been doing. So really excited to hear your version of it. Mavish, the floor is yours. Thank you. And oh, one more thing. Thank you so much for getting up early. Mavish is in New York, so this is crazy early. Thank you so much for doing that too.
Thank you very much, Magnus. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, albeit remotely. I think internet infrastructure is especially interesting to raise in this discussion because when we discuss content-related issues like disinformation, we tend to focus on the platforms or applications that run over infrastructure. And of course, this is important because, let's be clear, a fundamental part of the issue is the business models of the current dominant social media platforms that enable the diffusion and amplification of disinformation, despite mounting evidence of the threat to human rights that disinformation presents, as Arzu mentioned in her intervention. But we don't pay enough attention to the physical or tangible technologies that make up our networks, or the logical technologies, which are basically the rules that govern how data moves across them. And this is a problem because even though this physical and logical infrastructure is often invisible to public scrutiny, it is by no means neutral. These technologies have a fundamental impact on how gendered disinformation lives and thrives. And I think Arzu's intervention is a clear reflection of the fact that the problem of gendered disinformation is a systemic issue that doesn't just begin and end with a particular piece of content. And I think in the same way, this problem doesn't just begin and end with the applications or the platforms on which gender disinformation is shared. So let me give you some brief examples of the issues that my team have researched and worked on that really illustrate what I mean here. I think one example is the issue of zero rating and physical telecommunication infrastructure. In the Global South, predominantly, prepaid mobile subscriptions are often the primary and frankly only way to connect to the internet, particularly for women and other marginalized communities that may not have access to fixed internet at home or at an office or university or in public facilities. And zero rating is a policy practice where mobile network providers waive data caps for the use of certain apps. And it's a policy that's used regularly by network operators in Central and South America, in certain parts of Africa. And often these mobile network providers claim that this practice helps to compensate for the relative lack of infrastructure investment, as a way to manage the demand and strain on their networks. And the issue here is that zero-rated infrastructure has knock-on effects that then interact with the disinformation problem. It creates a dependency on the one or two information or communication platforms that are zero rated, through preferential agreements with the network operators. So when people are so dependent on a single platform like Facebook to be their primary gateway to information online, platform where disinformation runs rampant, it can be difficult to find alternative sources of information to then fact check and neutralize the power of that disinformation. I think another example is the issue of infrastructure security. And this, again, can touch on some of the struggles that Arzu spoke about. Even when cis women, trans people, non-binary people, journalists, media developers, and communicators are online, they face disproportionate threats of harassment. But this harassment doesn't just occur through social media platforms, unfortunately. There's security vulnerabilities in the design of the physical and logical infrastructure that support them in hosting their content online, whether we're talking about communications protocols that they use to connect to other devices or the actual servers that host their content. These vulnerabilities create opportunities for exploitation by eavesdroppers that can then glean information from the exposed data and then weaponize it for doxing, or by attackers that can then launch technical attacks to overwhelm the infrastructure and bring down the content. And this is an even bigger problem for small and community-owned infrastructure providers that just don't have the resources or capacity to continually maintain and improve the security of the infrastructure. So if the targets of gender disinformation that are also the most capable of neutralizing this disinformation are silenced from responding, whether by intimidation or pure destruction, how can we then accept that these are equitable platforms for expression? So I think taken all together, these examples really indicate how the decisions that go into the design, development, and deployment of internet infrastructure, they really do have implications for how women and gender minorities face gender disinformation and how gender disinformation can flourish. And I want to be clear, these are political choices. It's a series of decisions that determine which communities are worth infrastructure investments and robust connectivity that gives them meaningful agency in terms of where to get their information. It's a series of decisions that determine whether improved security provisions for the most marginalized are worth the rollout costs for multinational infrastructure providers, and whether communities have meaningful choices in terms of which infrastructure providers to rely on, or even whether they can build the secure infrastructure themselves. And of course, policymakers have a role in creating a regulatory environment that can shape these decisions. But I think the danger lies in the fact that even the non-regulatory spaces where many of the technical decisions of internet infrastructure happen can be quite exclusionary of perspectives that are outside the white male global north paradigm. And in the absence of meaningful representation of the perspectives and lived experiences of the majority of people, frankly, that rely on these technologies, existing offline inequities that are embedded in our real world end up mediating governance decisions that entrench and even exacerbate online inequities. So, in thinking about what's next, we need more representation of civil society, particularly from the global south, feminist, and other minority communities in the global spaces where technical internet standards are developed. Standards developing organizations, or SDOs, they are key non-regulatory spaces where internet infrastructure technologies that we use every day are decided. Acronyms that we think about, that we see every day, but don't really think much about, like HTTPS or Wi-Fi. But these spaces are often outside the focus of civil society, and they can be closed and opaque by design. And these are industry-driven spaces like the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, as well as intergovernmental spaces like the International Telecommunication Union. We really need to be in the room as civil society to advocate for our needs. For example, why we need stronger encryption for certain vulnerable aspects of our communication technologies, particularly when these cases don't neatly align with a clear business case. I think in particular, these decision-making spaces often sit outside the remit and capacities of media developers, but I think there's immense value for media developers to consider sending technologists to these spaces to discuss technical infrastructure issues that are critical to the delivery of a robust media environment, such as spectrum management to support radio broadcasting, or encryption to ensure strong communications protocols. So I think I'll leave it there and turn it back to you, Magnus. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was really, I learned a lot just from this brief conversation. I'm so glad to have you on this panel to bring this perspective, which I agree with you is often left out or has not yet been introduced, that in these spaces that we are in as a civil society, and also in media freedom and media development circles, but so crucial to how we move on from here and how we create something better. And to kind of move us into a conversation between all of us, I have, in our strategy work at IMS, we've kind of divided it up to kind of 3 strategic priorities, where because this is such a complex issue, there's so many layers, you can engage so many different forums and levels. We're looking at both kind of like short-term kind of damage control, like what is it right now that needs to be done for our local media partners to keep working, for women journalists to be able to publish and write their stories and be heard and have critical voices. Then we have kind of a diagnostic level, as several of you have alluded to. There's so much in this that we don't know. One of the reasons being how this is all structured and who have access to the data that is so central to how all of this is managed and governed. And our third priority, which I think is really crucial, is this kind of insisting on being not necessarily optimistic, but having some kind of vision of where do we want to go. Like a lot of the time we're going to do damage control, we're going to go to the big companies and say, this is not good enough, you need to make this solution better, you need to make this piece of infrastructure differently. But is there a way where we can kind of, as a community, civil society, journalistic community, and states for that matter, come together in a vision for how this could be done differently? And that's a tall order, but I feel on social media issues, for example, content moderation, the default assumption is that Facebook and Google will be around forever, and a couple of the other big platforms, right? Which I think is, of course, they have a lot of capital, they're going to be around. It's not but that you see changes, you see local initiatives that are working better, you see people interested in context-specific solutions, or you have answers in local communities that the tech companies don't have. How do you generate actual infrastructure or platforms or media businesses that kind of take advantage of that and take some of the ownership back to the local level, and thereby ensuring that local needs are met at in a way that a giant company from one part of the world is not just gonna. And they're, of course, front and center in that. How do you get more women into these spaces and actually creating the solutions? I don't think any of us is going to come up with the solutions. I think what we're here to do is set the framework, help push in a direction, so the young girl somewhere in the world who has a good idea 2, 3, 5 years from now, she's actually going to be empowered to implement, to execute, to make money off of it, to build a good solution that serves media communities in our case, but all kind of other local needs. So if you're open to that premise, I want to kind of start with the ambitious vision. Like, where do you see, how would you reimagine our digital infrastructures, our internet 20 years from now? Let's just put that out there. So we have time, we have resources, we can really change this. How would you see it organized, how governed, built, and not that you can solve it all, but that's my initial question. And then we move down to like, what pieces of information do we don't have, and what do we need to do immediately, kind of damage control level, if we have time for that. But if I can maybe go back to you, since you already touched upon some of this. How would you, what's your vision for digital infrastructures in 20 years from now?
Thanks, Magnus. It's not an easy question.
Oh, I know.
I think certainly not. But I think in the long term, we really need to envision a fundamentally different political economy of the internet. You know, the entrenchment that we see here is the result of the current business models of the internet, like I mentioned. We need a regulatory environment that facilitates a competitive and diverse market, not just in the context of social media platforms, but in the various subsectors of internet infrastructure services that we don't think about much on the policy level, but are also undergoing consolidation, right? Whether we're talking about domain name a service operation to content delivery networks. They have significant knock-on effects in terms of what kind of content is available and who is able to produce content on the internet. I think we really need the opportunity for communities to be able to build their own platforms and infrastructure, and for a robust environment where, you know, we have meaningful choices. And at the same time, I really think it's not a radical idea, but we really need to normalize the idea of embedding human rights approaches to each stage of the design, development, and deployment of technologies, and not just in circumstances where there is a business case for doing so. And I know it sounds like a simple vision. It doesn't sound radical, but, you know, in the context of this discussion, I think it would result in a truly fundamental shift in terms of, you know, who is considered a primary case for technologies. I mean, as you mentioned, that this one-size-fits-all approach to social media, it's devoid of local context. And that's because the primary cases, the subjects of these technologies, the people that are at the center of the design phase are, you know, typically white male global north, right? And in that case, then, you know, who is considered an edge case, right? And what an offensive term, but these are often structurally marginalized communities that are considered at the edges of the design. And so a one-size-fits-all media environment will always replicate offline inequities. We really need to consider a different environment where there are no edge cases. And I unfortunately, that is a radical vision, and that's where we are.
Thank you so much. Very. I love there's no edge cases. Like, yeah, that term is just great, and it's such essential in how you design now. But and not to put anyone on the spot, but since I can't see if you're marking Arsu, are you up for a comment on this as well?
Here's a controversial solution: decentralized internet. I think this is something that. There's a lot more conversation around developers, technologists, but also human rights community and journalists. I've recently been involved in one such conversation, and parts of it kind of were way over my head because it's too technological. But the idea that we, for instance, as journalists, can serve on our own servers, platforms, communication platforms where we get to decide who, when there is content that is threatening, or when there is content that is full of harassment, to be able to have that kind of control as a user is quite significant and remarkable, because we've not had that. So that's one idea. But also to what Mayfresh was saying, I think, we, in countries like Azerbaijan, although we complain about how little these social media platforms are doing, we rely on them on day-to-day basis, because in an environment where there is almost no access to independent media, social media platforms are places where journalists actually publish. These are the places where journalists reach out to their communities. These are the places where journalists research for stories and whatnot. And I think that over-reliance also is part of the problem when we talk about solutions. When we talk about creating alternative places, when we talk about supporting independent media, what kind of support that translates into. It's of course it's about financial support, but how to deviate from the existing places where media does exist, I think is a question that we need to tackle, speaking from like journalistic point of view, because this is something I've been thinking about for a while, and trying to figure out with friends who are managing online news platforms, who are being targeted online, and we haven't really found a solution that can work for everybody. However, insisting that companies do bring in journalist perspective, do bring in groups, marginalized community representatives when they discuss the new standards, when they discuss the new regulations, is of utmost importance. And I think I'll definitely stress that. But ideally, 20 years from now, we won't be talking about Facebook. We'll be talking about decentralized internet. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Really love it. Decentralized internet, of course, huge challenge, but I'm also thinking one of the kind of initiatives or tools I'm fascinated with is Mastodon, kind of a federated social media network that is getting some play, but of course not at the levels of Facebook and Twitter, etc., where the whole point is similar, that you have this community that regulates themselves under whatever, like the badminton club can set out their rules, and where the challenge for Facebook, of course, and with all the good intentions that might be somewhere in the system or were initially, I don't know, the challenge is that you have this approach of one size fits all, and implementing that across, right? You need this local context to kind of make the right call in so many issues, if it's content moderation, if it's infrastructure, big infrastructure decisions. If you don't know the local context, the odds that you're going to make the right decision are just so appallingly low, right? And so I think that's the fundamental challenge for these big companies. And then in decentralizing the internet, on the flip side, and this is, I really love that we're getting kind of pushing ourselves, and I wanted this session to be kind of explorative. We also somehow need to ensure and hammer this, that this needs to be on a human rights framework, right? Because I know authoritarian states that will also argue for a decentralized internet, and that's a very different version of what I have in mind when I hear decentralized internet, right? And so that's just one observation from my point. And then maybe, and I know as a representative from a state, there's different perspectives and different elements of this you can kind of join in on. But do you have a perspective, and what does Tech for Democracy see going forward, and like the long-term best case for a nation state like Denmark that is in kind of the same boat as us as civil society and journalists around the world that are challenged by these big players and have a hard time kind of navigating it at the moment?
Great, thanks. Yeah, but it's been really interesting to listen to examples and also the suggestions that just came up. And I think it's very much in line with what we also envision with the Tech for Democracy initiative, because we, at the one hand, work on this longer term vision and to kind of gain a momentum and bring stakeholders together around the long-term human rights-based approach to tech and have this vision, which for some may seem very optimistic, but we really believe that we have to have that goal to work towards, to also get everybody on board with that vision. And then at the same time also work with locally defined solutions, as I think many of you have also mentioned during this session. I mean, it's utmost importance that we really work to identify how we can better support locally based organizations, locally driven solutions, and also make that link between the locally defined and then the international work, both in terms of tech companies and the influence they have, but also I think in terms of international fora and existing human rights instruments. Like, how can we make the connection and how can we really ensure that the voices are included? I think Mavish was also talking about that. How do we ensure to get those who are actually mostly affected by this also in the long term, from marginalized communities, especially in Global South? How do we ensure that they are also represented in the conversations on how we want our digital infrastructure and digital future to look like going ahead? So I think a lot of what you've been mentioning is really what we are also aiming to address, and we really welcome everybody's involvement in this. And also, we will listen to all good ideas, and really what we try to do is to facilitate these conversations and partnership to showcase how we can actually address some of these challenges. So that was just briefly from my side. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate that. And I could go on in this kind of visionary level, and we might have a chance to jump back into it with questions from the audience. But I just want to move to the next level in kind of my strategic thinking, at least, which is this diagnostic level. And there's a lot we don't know. We can all agree on that. Everyone wants. But that's also where I think the media freedom community and media and journalistic practices in particular are interesting, in that all levels of society right now are grasping with all of the unknowns in this digital era. What are the key things? Like, if you could pick one or two issues that you would want us to understand, have the data access to understand, have journalists, have researchers, have someone kind of unpack what are the dynamics here that is really crucial to move forward on gender disinformation and the broader structural problems that we've just been discussing. And if one of you just want to take the word, I'm fine with that. I just can't see if you're marking, so if you can do that, otherwise I have to call on one of you.
I mean, it's really tough to describe, but I mean, or to point finger. But I think the overall understanding that we're not just talking about gender. It's far beyond, far more than one specific group, right? It's this parasite that is spreading and affecting many communities. And sadly, the communities that are affected the most are the ones who are vulnerable, or who do not have resources, or who do not have know-how. And even if they do, they don't have the power to change the narrative. I don't know if it answers your question, but this is, in my vision, I think this is the way forward. And we have been discussing about expanding the understanding. We've been bringing in conversation different actors, but I still think that we often forget that it's not just like one group. It's a global problem. It's a global phenomenon, and we can't just focus on that.
Yes. Thank you so much. I very much agree, and I think there in the current dynamics and how it's set up, like, because you designed and now you own your platforms and from the knowledge is being captured, and as Shoshana Shuba points out, captured with a handful of powerful companies, maybe also some Chinese, but dominantly American companies. And I really, in this media freedom context, this point when I first read it in her book, like a pre-Gutenberg era, right? Like you remove a chance for local communities to have information about what's happening in their own lives, because of course they can have it the old analog way and have conversations, but so much of our lives now are structured around, influenced, and by these data processes that the big tech companies, they might not even know what questions to ask from their data, but at least they have that data that makes it possible to understand how we're affected as communities when we're hit by gender disinformation. And maybe just one point, I have come across this called the Denomination Problem. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but the fact that you can do research at the moment and journalistic reporting on there's 10,000 misogynist Facebook posts here somehow defined. You could find that 10,000, right? What is really hard to find is the denominator. How big a chunk is this of the total Facebook post in that period, in that space? And how is it divided between users? There's a huge difference if 10,000 posts are read. It's like 90% of 10 people's media diet, or if 10,000 posts is like 3% of a million people's media diet, right? It's both things are problematic, but the solutions are very different. That's one of the places where I really see both journalistically, but also civil society and maybe academic research in particular, getting better access to some of this data without violating privacy, but giving us the opportunity to understand these patterns better would really make it much more likely that we can build good solutions, because right now we're kind of scrambling in the dark. I don't know, Mavish, not specifically on this point, but in general, what are you at Article 19? What's the knowledge, what's the data you would really want to have to move this forward meaningfully?
I mean, I think that's a difficult question. I mean, just as an aside, I think building off of Ars's point about being about really thinking about who's impacted the most by these issues. I think we focused a lot on women, and I think it's very important to recognize that women face disproportionate threats when it comes to gender disinformation. But of course, the subjects of gendered threats also include trans people, non-binary people, their gender minorities. And so I think it's really important for us to, sort of thinking about, who are the subjects, thinking also about intersectionality and the fact that the disproportionate impacts compound when we then think about people of color on these platforms, people from the global south. And so really taking an intersectional approach to how we're trying to understand gender disinformation and disinformation overall, I think is really key. I mean, going back to a critical point, it's something that we've been talking about a lot at Article 19, is that it's really critical that policymakers or any kinds of or researchers that are studying this issue really recognize that disinformation and these issues are rooted in offline historical and structural inequities. And that truly effective responses, because of course that's what we're trying to, that's hopefully our result from doing this research and doing these inquiries, is to find effective responses to these issues. They cannot focus purely on the platforms where disinformation is disseminated. And I think that's something that I just want to bring back to the fore, because it's just so critical here.
Very, very important points there. Thank you so much. And actually, we with that already ran out of little conversations. I want to continue this, and we still have the specific kind of damage control layer to get to. But I want to draw in the audience here, and let me know, both Colette, who's in the room with us, if you have people there that have a comment or a question, or maybe even a solution as we move to this third layer of like, what are solutions that is out there that should be scaled, or are they challenged in being scaled? Are there anyone from the audience that has a comment, or online? And I'll check as well. But if you can give me a heads up, yeah.
I'm keeping an eye out, and we've planted the seed that the floor is open for audience questions, but I don't think we have any hands at this moment, Magnus.
Okay, and yeah, production also. If we have anything online, let me know. But then I will just stay a little bit with this knowledge gap and draw you back in, and maybe as from a state perspective, which is one of the things that's fascinating and scary this kind of analysis is that suddenly we're on the same side. Usually state has all the resources and can do many more things, but when it comes to the tech debate, actually researchers, academics, civil society, journalists, and states are often in the same boat, that we don't have access to the data. These big companies do. How is that from a government perspective, and what would you want to know more about at this point?
Yeah, and that's exactly some of the work that we will be undertaking as under the Action Coalition on Online Gender Abuse and Harassment, as I mentioned before, that we're working on jointly with the US and other stakeholders. I mean, one of the key areas there is exactly that we all know the damage and the impact, but we don't really understand. We don't have the access to data. We don't understand the patterns, as there was also somebody who was mentioning before. We don't understand really the political and economic costs of gender-based online harassment and abuse. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and also to get access to that data. But we do think that through having a multi-stakeholder approach and including some of those who may have the data, or at least see how to get access to the data, that is one way to approach it. But I very much agree. It is a huge challenge that in order to really understand the topic and react to it, we need to have a better understanding of what does it actually, how does it influence societies. We also want to look at then, how can you then explore to develop international practices, norms, and principles to address online gender-based harassment and abuse, facilitated by technology, and how can it be again addressed through existing international principles and fora. And then I think the third component, which is important, is how we can really strengthen the prevention and response to gender-based online harassment. I think that's again also going back to the point of how do we link up with existing efforts offline, and again make that connection again to locally driven solutions. So yeah, very much agree. It is really a challenge that we don't have access to that data, and that we ought to have a better understanding of the patterns in order to address it.
Yes. Thank you so much. And Colette, maybe if I can also kind of draw you in, take advantage of you being put on this stage with us, because some of your work that I'm very fascinated with, and in my previous jobs have also been involved with, is this safety issue and the UN Action Plan for journalist safety as an example that has inspired me in my work on kind of multi-stakeholder approaches and a media community coming together to push something through that is actually, and there's challenges of course, but been efficient at many levels. So you, as not maybe a kind of someone sitting with tech issues day to day, multi-stakeholder approaches, how we as communities push an important issue, be it safety of journalists and the related issue of now gender disinformation and dysfunctioning technical environments. Do you have any observations or actions that are relevant here?
Thank you so much, Magnus. Yes, I'm the eyes and ears on the ground here for you now. I mean, well, those in the room probably know this, but across the hall now, we have the pledging session of all of the Media Freedom Coalition member states, making their commitments, for the next time period to media freedom. One of which, I mean, I think we're all on our toes now. We're going to find out, potentially, the amount of funding that may be put toward the media development community to combat, issues of gender disinformation, and more so than that. And we are cheerleaders for the multi-stakeholder approach, right? This is the foundation of the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. My role in Total at International Media Support is supporting this. This is getting all stakeholders at all levels thinking holistically and proactively about how to promote the safety of journalists and tackle the issue of impunity. And so that's why we have Azru with us today from the media sector. Civil society, we're delighted to civil society from Mewish and Anne from the Danish ministry with us. And throughout the conference yesterday, with my ears open, this is also what we heard from the International Fund for Public Interest Media, that this is not an issue that can be solved, one by each institution. This, can only be solved from a systemic level. We heard this also during the Rethink of the Media Freedom Coalition session from colleagues in Global Affairs Canada, that we are operating in this multi-stakeholder ecosystem, and it's the only way that we're going to take this forward. So that's my take from the ground today, and more to come tomorrow or later on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Claire. I think it's a good segue to kind of our last level here, that is damage control. Like, what is the most urgent thing states can go out to do today, civil society can go out to do, and maybe, as Colette alluded to, like coalitions. Like, I know it's a big part of Tech for Democracy. I know all of you are engaged in different forms of formal or informal coalitions, because we all agree and have mentioned several times we're not going to solve this by itself. And maybe let me just kind of open my question here with one coalition that I'm fairly inspired by, which is the Public Spaces Coalition in the Netherlands, which is different organizations with some kind of public interest mandate. It's media organizations with some kind of public funding. It's theater, it's libraries, it's some government institutions as well, that have this fundamental idea that we meet freely and have conversations somehow, or engage with a piece of art or something, and then as communities evolve based on that. And they've come together and said, like, if we force all our users and customers and kind of community members to have these conversations in a Facebook universe or in a Google universe, they're paying with their data. And that's counter to the mission that we fundamentally have. We, as a local radio station, can't kind of build the alternative, but how about we come together and agree on, we want some platforms, we want some infrastructure where we don't pay with our data, where there's more openness and freedom to express yourself in a respectful, human rights respecting way, and then push that forward. That's one of the coalitions which is national and fairly Dutch. Like, I don't think you can replicate it necessarily to all contexts, but there's something there, and they have some very tangible, good solutions they're working on. Are there other things that you see out there that are working right now, good concrete first steps, and how do we get to a better situation than where we are now? And maybe, I don't know, you up for going for this one? Did I? Sorry. Mevish, do you have a comment? Sorry if I put you on the spot. I'm just not able to see who's speaking.
That's all right, Magnus. I'm happy to go first. I couldn't hear you for a second. I think it's just the challenges of connecting remotely, right? In a pandemic world. I think in terms of immediate action, it's something that I already mentioned, is that bringing media developers and other really critical parts of our civil society into the technical internet governance spaces, where a lot of these technologies are discussed and decided pre-deployment, we have so few opportunities to be able to influence the trajectory of tech development before they become ubiquitous in our lives. And I think engaging, for example, in technical standards and technical standards developing organizations is a really key vector for us to be able to engage in that process, despite the fact that these are closed environments, often very opaque environments. I think it's really critical for us to build our civil society capacity to be able to engage there. And that, of course, includes media developers to be able to engage there.
Great, thank you. And this running out of time as well is probably also where we round things up. So, Anne, if you have anything, final remarks and concrete solutions that are top of your mind at this stage?
Yeah, I think it's important that we look at the existing structures we have in place. I mean, there are many super interesting and well-functioning coalitions, such as the Medium Freedom Coalition, the Freedom Online Coalition, and others. So I think it's really also about looking at the existing structures we have and really make sure that they are promoted and take the space and momentum that we experience right now in really bringing in this multi-stakeholder approach in the conversation. So I think there's a lot of super interesting initiatives going on. And from the Tech for Democracy side, we really hope that we can create that synergy between them and fill in a niche in that space. So I think I'm very optimistic, but I also like your 3 points about, there's also some urgent things that has to be addressed at the moment, of course. But I think as long as we kind of stay in that field of having an overall vision together and acknowledge that we can't do this on our own, and either as government, civil society, or tech companies and multilaterals, but we really have to work on it in a multi-stakeholder fashion. Then I think we're in a good space. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And finally, you, Arsu, as a journalist, what should states do? What should the media freedom community do? And what can journalists do themselves? Like, not that I'll answer all of them, but what's your point here on immediate, urgent actions?
I think from the journalists' point of view, I think we should also advocate for the platforms to follow the guidelines that they signed up to under the Santa Clara Principles on transparency and accountability. The document was reiterated. It was signed in 2018, but it's been reiterated in 2021. And I think it's really important that when we are critical of the platform's lack of action, when we demand more decisive actions on behalf of the platforms, we do so not just saying that's our right, which is as users, but also using the existing documentation, such as the Santa Clara Principles, such as the evidence that we collect from our colleagues based on our personal experiences, showing the type of disinformation, the type of harassment, the type of violations that take place on these platforms, demanding that actions are taken immediately. And there's also credibility to us as users, but also as reporters of what's going on. And I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, to continue advocating for platforms to actually disclose their algorithms, because we need to have a say in how they're developed, because that affects us immediately as users, as journalists, as representatives of marginalized groups and whatnot.
What a fantastic. Thank all three of you so much, and Mavish and Arsu for joining us and for putting up with changes and making it doable to moderate. It's always a pleasure when you have great speakers. So thank you so much. Now, for me, it's the most frustrating part of not being there physical, all the new conversations, all the good ideas that pops up in a room when you had inspiring conversations, as I hope this one has been. So in the absence of being able to say hi to those of you in the room, please email me at mag@report.org, and me on Twitter at magnus. I would love to continue this conversation. This is something IMS is exploring. We are very aware that this is a new field, that there's many different options, that this is a long-term effort. So we're really into having these conversations. joining different coalitions, existing and new ones. So please reach out to me, to other panelists. I'm sure would also be happy to give us have a say in some of these developments. And thank you so much, and not least to you, Colette, for putting it all in time. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right.